When Sheila told me that Sunday afternoon that I should sell my Volvo to help her mother buy a house, I didn't have a breakdown. I didn't even raise my voice. I just went very, very quiet. That car was the last project my husband and I worked on together before he passed away, and when Leo didn't even look up from his coffee, I realized something important. I didn't need to scream. I just needed to stop letting everyone treat me like I was a convenience store that never closed. I set my dessert fork down on the plate as gently as I could manage. Later that evening, after everyone had gone back to their routines, I quietly took the Volvo keys off the hallway hook and slipped them into my pocket. My daughter-in-law had actually suggested that I sell my favorite car so her mother could have a down payment on a house, and then she had the audacity to smirk and say, "It's just a car, Diane." The disappointment that settled over me wasn't loud or dramatic. It was cold, sharp, and impossible to ignore. The conversation had happened during what should have been an ordinary Sunday coffee in my living room. My husband had been gone for 5 years, but the Volvo remained one of the last tangible things we had built together. It wasn't simply transportation. It was a piece of our history, a collection of memories polished into chrome and carefully preserved over time. While Sheila casually discussed selling it, Leo sat motionless beside her, stirring his coffee, as though he could somehow disappear into the mug. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply looked at her and said, "My car isn't for sale." Sheila rolled her eyes immediately. "You barely drive long distances anymore, and my mom really needs a place of her own. We could use that cash as a down payment. Besides, you're living in this big house all by yourself. It's a bit much for one person, don't you think?" I turned toward Leo, hoping for at least a flicker of discomfort or support, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. In that moment, everything became painfully clear. This wasn't a spontaneous suggestion Sheila had dreamed up on her own. They had talked about it together. My son had already agreed that pieces of my life were negotiable assets available whenever they decided someone else deserved them more. There was no point arguing with people who no longer respected the difference between generosity and ownership. Instead, I gathered the empty plates and carried them into the kitchen. As I passed through the hallway, I took the Volvo keys from their usual place and tucked them deeper into my pocket. It was a small action, but it felt significant, like laying the first brick in a wall that should have been built a long time ago. From the kitchen, I could hear Sheila complaining about my stubbornness, while Leo offered his usual useless silence. I switched off the coffee maker, stood there for a moment, and allowed myself to accept what I had been avoiding for months. Things inside this house were about to change, and this time, the changes wouldn't be temporary. The first sign appeared the very next morning. When I walked into the kitchen, I immediately noticed that Sheila had rearranged everything again. My favorite mugs had been pushed into a high cabinet where I could barely reach them, while her expensive smoothie equipment occupied the prime space on the counter. It was a small thing on the surface, but it carried a clear message. Sheila wasn't living in my house anymore. In her mind, she was gradually taking ownership of it. Normally, I would have sighed, moved things around quietly, and avoided conflict. Not anymore. Without making an announcement, I returned my coffee maker and mugs to their proper places, then carried the smoothie machine into the pantry where it belonged. After that, I walked into my office, gathered the financial documents and personal papers that mattered most, and closed the door behind me. Then I locked it. The soft click of the lock turning into place was surprisingly satisfying. About an hour later, I heard someone rattling the doorknob. "Why is this locked?" Sheila shouted from the hallway. I was sitting at the dining table reading the newspaper and drinking coffee. "Because it's my private office," I replied without looking up. A few seconds later, she stormed into the kitchen. "But the printer is in there. I need to print something for work." I calmly turned another page. "Then I suggest you buy a printer for upstairs. My office will remain locked from now on." She stood there staring at me for a moment before spinning around and marching back upstairs. Not long afterward, Leo came down looking uncomfortable, but noticeably avoided mentioning the office or the printer. They were both waiting for me to back down, because backing down was what I had always done. The version of me they knew was patient, accommodating, and eager to keep everyone happy. The version they were about to meet was very different. Wednesday evenings had developed a predictable routine over the previous year. Sheila and Leo would go out, and I would prepare dinner, clean the kitchen, and make sure everything was handled before they left. Nobody ever asked me to do it. They simply assumed I would. That Wednesday afternoon, I put on a nice blouse, picked up my purse, and reached for my umbrella. Around 4 o'clock, Sheila came downstairs fully dressed and ready for the evening. "The chicken is in the fridge," she said casually while walking through the kitchen. "We're leaving at 6:30, so it'd be great if dinner was ready by 6. I slipped on my coat and looked at her. "Then you'd better start cooking." She stopped walking immediately. "What, I have plans." "You can't leave now," she protested. "We have reservations. Who's making dinner?" I adjusted my scarf in the hallway mirror. "You're both adults. I'm sure you'll manage. Have a nice evening." Then I walked out the front door, leaving behind a silence far more effective than any argument could have been. I walked to a small cafe a few blocks from home, ordered a slice of apple pie, and settled into a quiet corner with a novel. The outing itself wasn't particularly important. What mattered was that for the first time in months, I wasn't reorganizing my evening around two adults who had come to view my time as a household utility. I stayed there for nearly 3 hours, enjoying the simple pleasure of being left alone while my phone buzzed twice with calls from Leo that I had no intention of answering. When I finally returned home later that evening, the house was dark except for the light above the stove. An empty pizza box sat abandoned in the sink, evidence that neither starvation nor catastrophe had occurred in my absence. I smiled to myself, dropped the box into the recycling bin, and headed upstairs. There had been no argument, no dramatic confrontation, and no emotional speeches. All I had done was refuse to provide a service they assumed came automatically with my existence. The next morning breakfast was conducted in complete silence. Sheila stared at her phone, Leo focused on his cereal, and neither of them spoke a word to me. The atmosphere was icy, but I found myself enjoying my coffee more than usual. Their disapproval carried far less weight once I stopped measuring my worth by how useful I was to them. After they left for work, I opened my laptop and decided it was time to examine something I should have reviewed long ago. 2 years earlier, when Leo was changing jobs, I had added him to one of my accounts so he would have emergency access to funds if things became difficult. At the time, it seemed like a reasonable precaution. Somewhere along the way, however, emergency assistance had quietly evolved into a permanent arrangement. I began scrolling through the account history. The further I looked, the more disturbing the pattern became. There were grocery purchases, gas station charges, restaurant visits, and endless small transactions that added up to thousands of dollars over time. There were also expensive skincare purchases from Sephora specialty health products, and countless expenses that had absolutely nothing to do with emergencies. Both Leo and Sheila had stable careers, yet they were treating my account as though it existed to supplement their lifestyle. The sadness lasted only a few moments before something stronger replaced it. Resolve. I closed the laptop, picked up my purse, and drove directly to the bank. Mr. Henderson greeted me with his usual smile the moment I stepped into his office. "Diane, what can I do for you today? I'd like to remove Leo Miller from my account immediately," I said. "I'd also like to cancel his card and stop all automatic payments connected to the utilities for the upstairs suite." He looked at me for a moment, nodded, and began typing. Done and done. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. It's remarkable how quickly a problem can be solved once you stop making excuses for it. On the drive home, I stopped at the grocery store. For years, I had automatically purchased things that weren't even for me. Sheila's organic juices, Leo's preferred snacks, specialty coffee pods, and countless little items I rarely touched myself. This time, I bought only what I actually needed. The cart was noticeably lighter, and when I unpacked everything at home, I placed the groceries neatly on a shelf that belonged solely to me. As I closed the refrigerator door, I felt something shift inside me. The financial umbilical cord had finally been cut. I knew the consequences would arrive sooner rather than later. At some point, a card would be declined, a payment would fail, or a purchase would be rejected. There would be confusion, outrage, and accusations. Under normal circumstances, the thought might have made me anxious. Instead, I felt calm. For too long, I had allowed generosity to become an expectation. I had convinced myself that helping my son was the same thing as supporting him even when the help was quietly preventing him from standing on his own feet. Friday afternoon brought exactly the reaction I expected. I was sitting in the living room working on a knitting project when the front door burst open hard enough to rattle the walls. Sheila stormed inside with Leo following several steps behind, and one glance at their faces told me everything I needed to know. "Your card didn't work," Sheila snapped, throwing the bank card onto the coffee table. I was standing at the checkout with a full cart, and it got declined. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? I carefully set my knitting aside before answering. "Yes," I said calmly. "I canceled it yesterday." For a moment, she simply stared at me. "Why would you do that without warning us?" "Because it was never supposed to become a permanent source of spending money," I replied. "That card was for emergencies when Leo was between jobs. Those circumstances ended a long time ago." She crossed her arms immediately. "We used that card for the house." I looked from her to my son. "No," I said. "You used that card for your lives." "There's a difference." Leo finally spoke. "Mom, you could have at least talked to us first." Sheila was really embarrassed. I met his eyes directly. "What's embarrassing Leo is discovering that your adult son and daughter-in-law have been quietly using their mother's account to subsidize expenses they can easily afford themselves. You live here rent-free. You don't pay utilities. You both have good incomes. The free ride is over." The room fell silent. For once, there was nothing they could say that would make their position sound reasonable. Sheila recovered first. "You're being selfish," she said sharply. "You're sitting in this huge house with all this money while we're trying to build a future." I leaned back comfortably. "Your father and I spent 40 years building this future," I replied. "Now it's your turn to build your own." Then I picked up my knitting again. "This conversation is over." Neither of them moved immediately. They stood there waiting for anger, guilt, or negotiation, but I offered none of those things. Eventually, Sheila turned and marched upstairs while Leo followed behind her in silence. As the bedroom door slammed somewhere above me, I returned to my knitting and felt lighter than I had in years. The first real boundary had been challenged, tested, and successfully defended, and for the first time in a very long while, my life finally felt like it belonged to me again. The Cold War lasted for nearly 2 weeks. Nobody yelled, nobody apologized. Instead, the house settled into a strange rhythm of slammed doors, clipped conversations, and carefully maintained silence. Sheila stopped speaking to me unless absolutely necessary, while Leo drifted through the rooms looking increasingly uncomfortable. Under different circumstances, I might have felt guilty about the tension, but guilt had lost much of its power over me by then. Every day that passed only reinforced how much of my life I had spent accommodating people who viewed accommodation as an entitlement rather than a gift. The real turning point arrived when Sheila's mother came for a weekend visit. Mrs. Gable had always possessed a remarkable ability to make herself comfortable in places that didn't belong to her. Within 15 minutes of arriving, she was settled into my living room, criticizing the furniture as though she were conducting an inspection. "These sofas are so dated," she remarked while looking around. "When Sheila and Leo take over the downstairs, we should definitely go with something lighter. It'll open the whole room up." I sat quietly in my armchair, sipping tea. Nobody had asked me whether Sheila and Leo were taking over anything. The fact that Mrs. Gable spoke as though it were already settled told me more than she probably intended. A few minutes later, Sheila walked in carrying coffee for her mother and immediately joined the conversation. "Yeah, we've talked about doing a full renovation once we restructure things." I didn't respond. I simply listened. The two of them continued discussing my house as though I were no longer part of the equation, casually redesigning rooms, replacing furniture, and planning a future that apparently involved me fading conveniently into the background. What struck me wasn't the disrespect itself. It was how comfortable they felt expressing it openly. That afternoon, I received another unpleasant surprise. While washing dishes, I happened to glance out the kitchen window and noticed Sheila and her mother standing in the driveway. Curious, I watched them for a moment. Mrs. Gable was pacing off measurements beside my Volvo while Sheila nodded enthusiastically. "A carport would fit perfectly right here for my car," Mrs. Gable called out. The statement was so absurd that I almost laughed. Not only were they discussing renovations to my property, but now they were planning parking accommodations for a woman who didn't even live there. Standing at the sink, I suddenly realized that this wasn't about individual incidents anymore. It wasn't about the Volvo, the kitchen, the printer, or the bank account. It was about a mindset. They genuinely believed my home was already theirs. Instead of confronting them, I dried my hands and walked upstairs to my office. Once inside, I locked the door behind me, sat at my desk, and pulled out a fresh legal pad. For several minutes, I simply stared at the blank page while organizing my thoughts. I didn't need a lawyer. I didn't need a dramatic family showdown. What I needed was a plan. Slowly and methodically, I began writing. If they wanted to behave like homeowners, then they could start experiencing life as tenants. I outlined practical expectations, financial responsibilities, timelines, and options. Everything was straightforward, reasonable, and impossible to misunderstand. By the time I finished, I felt calmer than I had in months. The following week brought another opportunity. A long holiday weekend was approaching, and Sheila had spent days talking about a mountain getaway she and Leo were planning. Every conversation seemed to revolve around hiking trails, scenic views, and the comfortable drive they intended to enjoy getting there. The comfortable drive, of course, involved my Volvo. Nobody had asked. Nobody had mentioned borrowing it. They simply assumed it would be available. In previous years, that assumption would probably have been correct. This time, however, things were different. Tuesday morning, I woke up before sunrise. The house was silent as I packed a small overnight bag, dressed comfortably, and prepared a travel mug of coffee. Several weeks earlier, I had booked a quiet hotel on the coast without telling anyone. At the time, I wasn't entirely sure why I felt compelled to do it. Standing in the kitchen that morning, the answer seemed obvious. I needed distance. I needed peace. And most importantly, I needed to remind myself that I was allowed to make plans that didn't revolve around everyone else. A few minutes later, I stepped into the cool morning air, climbed into the Volvo, and backed slowly out of the driveway. I didn't leave a note. I didn't ask permission. And for the first time in a very long while, that felt wonderful. Around 9 o'clock, my phone began ringing. Leo. I let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, a text message appeared. "Mom, where are you?" "Where's the car?" "We were supposed to leave for the mountains today." I pulled into a rest area overlooking the highway and typed a brief reply. "I'm away for a few days. I needed my car. Enjoy your weekend." Then I silenced the phone and placed it in the glove compartment. As I merged back onto the road, I couldn't help smiling. Somewhere behind me, Sheila was probably staring at packed suitcases, while Leo struggled to explain why the vehicle they never bothered asking to borrow wasn't sitting in the driveway waiting for them. For years, they had confused access with ownership. This trip was simply my way of reminding them that there was a difference. The ocean was waiting, and for the first time in months, so was a little freedom. I spent 3 wonderful days on the coast doing almost nothing at all, and that was exactly what made them so enjoyable. I walked along the beach in the mornings, sat with a book in the afternoons, and listened to the sound of the waves after sunset. For the first time in years, nobody expected me to solve problems, provide transportation, or finance someone else's plans. The silence felt restorative in a way I hadn't realized I needed. Every so often I checked my phone. The messages arrived exactly as expected. At first they were confused. Then they became irritated. Eventually they turned accusatory. Sheila sent several texts about how inconsiderate it was to leave without warning, while Leo kept insisting that they had already packed and made reservations. What neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge was the simple fact that the Volvo belonged to me. They spoke as though I had borrowed their car rather than taken my own. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply enjoyed my trip. By Friday afternoon, I felt rested, clear-headed, and completely prepared for whatever awaited me at home. As I turned into my neighborhood, I could practically feel the tension before I even stepped through the front door. Leo's hatchback sat parked crookedly near the curb, and every instinct told me they had spent the past 3 days building a case against me. The moment I walked into the living room, those instincts were confirmed. Both of them were waiting. Sheila jumped to her feet before I had even set down my bag. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "We had to cancel our entire trip because you disappeared with the car." I calmly removed my coat and hung it in the closet. "That was incredibly selfish," she continued. "Do you have any idea how much money we lost?" I looked at her for the first time. "It's my car, Sheila." The simplicity of the statement seemed to irritate her even more. Leo stood up as well. "Mom, come on. That's not the point. We were counting on it." I nodded slowly. "I know you were." The room fell silent. "You count on a lot of things." Neither of them seemed to like where the conversation was heading, which is why I reached into my purse and removed the envelope I had prepared before leaving for the coast. I placed it carefully on the coffee table between us and stepped back. Leo frowned. "What's this A lease agreement?" I replied. "For the upstairs suite." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Leo opened the envelope and began reading. The document was straightforward. It outlined a fair monthly rent based on local market rates, included a reasonable utility contribution, and specified that the arrangement would begin on the first day of the following month. There were no tricks, no penalties, and no inflated numbers. It simply reflected the reality that adults generally pay for the places they live. Sheila stared at me in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious. You're charging your own son rent." I folded my hands calmly. "I'm treating my son like an adult." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. For years, every benefit they received had been disguised as normal. Free housing, free utilities, free access to my car. My time and my money had slowly become expectations rather than privileges. The lease forced all of that into the open. "If you want to continue living here," I said, "sign the lease. If you don't want to sign it, that's completely your choice. In that case, you'll have until the end of next month to find somewhere else to live." Sheila looked as though I had personally betrayed her. "You would actually throw us out." "No," I replied. "I'm offering you options." Then I picked up my bag and headed toward the stairs. The conversation was over. For the next several days, the house became a pressure cooker. Doors slammed. Whispered arguments drifted through the ceiling late at night. Every so often, I would hear my name followed by long stretches of angry discussion. They were convinced I was bluffing. More importantly, they were convinced that if they waited long enough, I would eventually return to being the woman who always prioritized their comfort over her own. They were wrong. Wednesday evening finally brought the confrontation they had been building toward. I was standing in the kitchen pouring a glass of water when Leo walked in carrying the unsigned lease. His expression suggested he had rehearsed the conversation several times. "Mom," he said, placing the papers on the table, "we're not paying this. Sheila won't agree to it, and honestly, I don't either. We're moving out." The statement hung in the air. He clearly expected shock, maybe even panic. Perhaps he imagined I would immediately start negotiating. Instead, I took a sip of water and nodded. "That's your choice." Leo blinked. For a second, he looked genuinely confused. "I mean it," he continued. "We're leaving. Then please make sure the upstairs is cleaned properly before you go," I replied. "And I'll need all the keys back by the end of the month." His jaw tightened. The reaction he wanted never came. There was no pleading, no guilt, no attempt to stop him. Only acceptance. For the first time, he seemed to understand that the leverage he thought he had no longer existed. After several uncomfortable seconds, he picked up the lease, turned around, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. I finished my water, rinsed the glass, and placed it in the dishwasher. Upstairs, another argument started shortly afterward. This time, however, it sounded different. The certainty was gone. And in its place was the unmistakable sound of two people realizing they had just called a bluff that wasn't a bluff at all. The final 2 weeks passed in a blur of cardboard boxes, packing tape, and increasingly strained silence. Once Leo realized I wasn't going to change my mind, the mood in the house shifted from defiance to reluctant acceptance. Sheila still carried herself as though she were the victim of some terrible injustice, but even she seemed to understand that no amount of anger was going to reverse what had already been set in motion. I stayed out of their way. I didn't help them pack. I didn't interfere. I simply continued living my life. Every morning I drank my coffee in peace, worked in my garden, and enjoyed the growing sense that my home was slowly returning to me. For years I had mistaken keeping the peace for maintaining a family. What I was discovering now was that peace and surrender were not the same thing. The upstairs suite gradually emptied. Boxes began appearing in the hallway. Furniture disappeared one piece at a time. Every evening another load was carried out to the car. Meanwhile, Sheila moved through the house with an expression of carefully rehearsed suffering, making sure everyone around her knew how unfairly she believed she had been treated. Under different circumstances, I might have felt compelled to comfort her. Instead, I reminded myself that adults are responsible for the consequences of their own choices. The truth was simple. They had been offered a fair lease. They had declined it. Everything that followed was the direct result of that decision. As moving day approached, I found myself feeling surprisingly calm. There was no triumph in it. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. If anything, I felt a quiet sadness that things had reached this point. But sadness is not the same thing as regret, and I didn't regret a single boundary I had established. The last Saturday of the month arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. Shortly after breakfast, a U-Haul truck pulled into the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as movers carried boxes down the front steps. The process took most of the day, and by late afternoon the truck was nearly full. The constant movement of furniture and belongings created a strange sense of finality, as though the house itself understood that a chapter was ending. By sunset, only a few final items remained. A short time later, I heard a knock on the patio door. When I opened it, Leo was standing there holding 2 sets of keys. He looked exhausted. Not angry, not defensive, just tired. "Here are the keys," he said quietly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The young man standing in front of me wasn't the little boy I used to tuck into bed, nor was he the entitled adult who had spent the past 2 years treating my generosity like an obligation. He looked like someone caught between those 2 versions of himself, unsure of where he belonged. "Take care of yourself, Leo," I said. It wasn't a dramatic goodbye. There were no speeches, no lectures, no last-minute attempts to revisit old arguments. Just a simple statement from a mother who still loved her son, even if she refused to rescue him anymore. He nodded slowly. "I will." Then he turned, climbed into Sheila's car, and drove away. I stood on the patio until the vehicle disappeared around the corner. Once it was gone, I slipped the keys into my pocket and took a long, steady breath. The silence that settled over the property felt different from the silence that had existed before. This wasn't loneliness. It was peace. The following morning, I walked upstairs for the first time since they had moved out. The rooms were completely empty except for a few forgotten hangers in a closet and a small lamp they had apparently decided wasn't worth taking. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating patches of dust where furniture had once stood. I opened every window in the suite and let the fresh air sweep through the rooms. As the breeze moved through the space, I began making plans. The larger bedroom would become a guest room for friends. The smaller room would become a craft studio. The possibilities felt exciting in a way I hadn't experienced for years. Nobody was going to rearrange my kitchen anymore. Nobody was going to use my bank account as supplemental income. Nobody was going to discuss selling my Volvo or redesigning my house while I sat quietly in the corner. I hadn't needed lawyers. I hadn't needed a family war. All I had done was stop acting like a doormat. Sometimes that's enough. Over the following months, the house slowly transformed. Fresh paint went up in the guest room. New shelves filled the craft room. The garden expanded. Friends visited more often. Little by little, every space began reflecting my own life again, instead of accommodating someone else's expectations. And for the first time in a very long while, walking through my front door felt like coming home. 6 months later, Leo came by on a quiet Sunday afternoon. He came alone. That detail didn't escape my notice. Sheila had made it very clear that she wanted nothing to do with my house anymore, and honestly, I was perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. Some distances create bitterness. Others create peace. In our case, I suspected it was a little of both. When I opened the door, Leo was holding a small cake box from a local bakery. He looked older than he had 6 months earlier. The confidence that came from always having a safety net beneath him had been replaced by something more grounded. There were new lines around his eyes, and although he seemed tired, he also seemed more present than he had in years. "Thought I'd stop by," he said. "I'm glad you did." We carried coffee and cake out to the patio. The garden was thriving by then. The roses had filled in beautifully, the vegetable beds were producing more tomatoes than I knew what to do with, and the entire yard felt alive in a way it hadn't when I was constantly managing other people's problems. For a while, we simply sat there enjoying the sunshine and talking about ordinary things. Eventually, the conversation turned toward life in their new apartment. "It costs a lot more than we expected," Leo admitted with a tired laugh. "We're both working extra hours now." I nodded. "Apartments tend to do that when you're the one paying for them." He looked down at his coffee cup before continuing. "I didn't realize how much you were covering for us. Not just the money. Everything else, too." I didn't interrupt. The groceries, the utilities dinners, the house, all the little things I never paid attention to. He shook his head. "I guess I got used to it." The honesty in his voice sounded genuine. "Most people do," I said quietly. "The danger is when appreciation disappears and entitlement takes its place." He nodded slowly. Neither of us mentioned Sheila. Neither of us needed to. Some conversations don't require names. Instead, we talked about work, the garden, and a few repairs I planned to make around the house. The discussion felt surprisingly normal, which was perhaps the biggest change of all. For years, nearly every interaction had revolved around some request expectation or problem that needed solving. Now we were simply two adults having coffee together. Before leaving, Leo helped me carry a bag of garden clippings to the compost bin. As we walked back toward the driveway, his eyes drifted toward the garage. The Volvo was parked exactly where it always was. Freshly washed, perfectly maintained, still gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. "She looks good, Mom," he said softly. I smiled. "Yes, she does." For a moment we both stood there looking at the car. What he saw was probably an old vehicle. What I saw was a lifetime of memories, years of hard work, and a promise I had finally kept to myself. "And she still runs like a dream," I added. A small smile crossed his face. "I figured she would." A few minutes later, he climbed into his car and started the engine. Before pulling away, he lowered the window and looked back at me. "Thanks for having me over." "Anytime, Leo." Then he drove off. I stood in the driveway watching until his car disappeared around the corner. The visit hadn't fixed everything. Relationships rarely work that way. But it felt like a beginning, and sometimes beginnings are enough. When I went back inside, I locked the front door behind me and turned the deadbolt with a quiet click. The sound reminded me of the office door I had locked months earlier, the first small boundary that started all of this. Back then, I was protecting a room. In reality, I had been protecting something much larger: my peace, my dignity, my life. As I walked through the house, sunlight streamed through the windows and settled across the hardwood floors. The guest room was ready for friends. The craft room was filled with projects waiting to be finished, and the kitchen looked exactly the way I wanted it to look. Every mug sat where it belonged, every drawer stayed organized, and every corner reflected the person who actually lived there. I wasn't a martyr. I wasn't a villain. I wasn't an ATM, a maid, or a retirement plan. I was simply a woman who had finally remembered that kindness and self-respect can exist side by side. The day Sheila suggested selling my Volvo, she thought she was talking about a car. What she really did was force me to see how much of myself I had been giving away. In the end, I kept the Volvo. More importantly, I kept my home, my boundaries, and my sense of self. And that turned out to be worth far more than any house, any down payment, or any amount of money could ever buy. Looking back now, I sometimes think that the conversation about the Volvo was never really about a car. It was simply the moment that forced me to see what had been happening all along. Little by little, I had allowed my time, my money, my home, and even my peace of mind to become communal property available whenever someone else wanted them. The truth is, I never wanted revenge. I didn't want my son to struggle, and I certainly didn't want conflict. What I wanted was respect, and when respect disappeared, boundaries became necessary. The moment I stopped rescuing everyone from the consequences of their choices, they finally had the opportunity to stand on their own. These days, the house is quiet, but it's the kind of quiet that feels comforting rather than lonely. The garden is thriving, my craft room is always full of unfinished projects, and the Volvo still sits in the driveway exactly where it belongs. Every time I see it, I'm reminded not just of my husband, but of the lesson I learned far too late: kindness should be given freely, never demanded. Sometimes the most important thing you can save isn't a house, a bank account, or even a cherished car. Sometimes it's yourself.
This story is a work of fiction inspired by real-life situations that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. While the characters and events have been shaped for storytelling, the emotions, conflicts, and choices reflect truths that exist in everyday life. At Quiet Revenge Stories channel, every story is created to explore the complexity of human relationships, especially the difficult moments that test trust boundaries and self-worth. These stories are not just about drama, but about awareness, resilience, and the courage it takes to protect yourself when it matters most. The message behind our stories is simple, but powerful: love should never require you to lose yourself, and kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Life will sometimes place you in situations where you must choose between keeping peace and protecting your dignity, and in those moments, choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of something real, consider supporting the channel by subscribing to Quiet Revenge Stories channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, each one carrying a lesson, a reflection, or a truth worth hearing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.